It was supposed to be a getaway, a peaceful retreat far from the chaos of the city. The kind of escape you dream about when the noise of everyday life becomes unbearable. A few days in a secluded cabin deep in the forest, with nothing but the sound of nature to keep you company. I thought I'd found the perfect place, untouched, serene, and isolated. But I didn't realize then that sometimes isolation isn't the escape we think it is. The journey to the cabin was longer than I expected. The road twisted and turned like a snake, and the deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the world seemed to fall away. The trees were dense and tall, their leaves whispering in the wind like secrets. I could see nothing beyond them, not even the sky. The path became narrow, and my car barely squeezed through the thick undergrowth. The further I went, the more I felt like I was leaving everything familiar behind. The city, the noise, the people, it all felt so distant now. When I finally arrived, the cabin stood before me, seemingly untouched by time. A small weathered wooden structure with moss creeping along its roof and walls. It was perfect, exactly what I had imagined. A peaceful sanctuary, away from everything. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns. Just the cabin and the forest that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. I unloaded my things and made my way inside, the door creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. The cabin smelled of wood, fresh pine, and the faint mustiness of a place that hadn't been used in a while. The interior was cozy, though a little old-fashioned. A stone fireplace dominated the living room, and an old wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. A staircase led to a loft, where a small bed awaited me. It was perfect, everything I needed to get away from it all. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking my bags, and making a fire. The crackling sound of burning wood was soothing, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I was alone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. No deadlines, no responsibilities, no expectations. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. But as night fell, an unsettling quiet began to settle in. It wasn't the usual peace I expected. It was different, as if the silence was too thick, too oppressive. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on the isolation and the fact that I was in a new place. After all, there was no reason to be nervous, right? I opened a book and settled into the armchair by the fire, the flames casting eerie shadows across the room. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else. Something soft, almost like footsteps. I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. It was faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my legs suddenly feeling heavy, my breath shallow. I moved cautiously toward the window, the shadows in the room seeming to close in around me. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. I peered out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just the trees, their gnarled branches swaying in the faint breeze. I forced myself to step back from the window, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. It was just the forest settling, nothing more. I returned to the armchair, my eyes never straying far from the window. But as I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night stretched on, each passing hour growing more uncomfortable. The footsteps never returned, but the air seemed to grow heavier, as though something or someone was watching. I kept the fire burning, trying to convince myself that it was just the loneliness of the place making me jumpy. But deep down, I knew that there was something more, something that wasn't quite right. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. The small bed in the loft felt far too large for just one person, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift with the flickering light of the fire. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves felt amplified in the silence. It was in that silence, in the dead of night, that I first noticed it. The quiet hum of something just beyond my perception, like a presence, lingering in the dark corners of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just out of reach, just beyond the edge of my awareness. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But the longer I lay there, the more I realized that whatever it wasn't going away. And just when I thought I might drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, slow and methodical, as if someone or something was tapping on the glass with purpose. I wanted to ignore it, to pull the blankets over my head and pretend it wasn't happening. But I couldn't. The sound was too distinct, too real. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I crawled out of bed and tiptoed toward the window. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. And then, with a shaking hand, I slowly pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just the forest, dark and still. But the tapping had stopped. The night was creeping in as I walked deeper into the forest. The sound of my boots crunching against the dry leaves the only noise in the otherwise silent surroundings. I had arrived at the cabin earlier, the place that had been described to me by an old man in the nearby village. He had warned me about the forest, how it was ancient, how it carried secrets, and how no one who had gone into the woods at night had ever returned quite the same. But I was no stranger to the unknown. I had been fascinated by the stories of hidden places, of abandoned cabins, and dark legends that surrounded them. This was no different. The cabin was quaint, nestled between towering trees, hidden behind thick vines and overgrown bushes. As I pushed open the door, it creaked on its rusty hinges, and a rush of cold air filled the room. The wooden floorboards beneath me groaned, as if the cabin itself were alive, and perhaps it was. The scent of damp wood, old books, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air, making my skin crawl just a little. I shrugged off the feeling and made my way to the small fireplace. I could feel my excitement building. This place was a treasure trove of history waiting to be uncovered. I began exploring the room, running my fingers along dusty shelves stacked with weathered books and trinkets, remnants of a life that had long since faded. But there was one object that caught my eye. It was an old journal tucked away in the corner of the shelf, its cover cracked and worn with age. Curiosity piqued, I reached for it and opened the first page. The handwriting was messy and erratic, as though the writer had been in a hurry, or perhaps in distress. As I flipped through the pages, the entries grew increasingly frantic. The writer spoke of hearing voices in the night, of footsteps that echoed through the empty rooms, and of a strange presence that lurked just outside the cabin, watching. The final entry was the most chilling. I can feel it now. It's inside the walls. It's waiting. A shiver ran down my spine, but I quickly brushed it off. Old stories, old fears. This was just a piece of history, not something to be feared. I set the journal aside and glanced around the room. The air had grown thick, heavy, with an energy I couldn't quite place. As I made my way to the kitchen, a strange sound interrupted the stillness. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, soft, unintelligible. I froze, straining my ears. The whispering grew louder, clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. I stood there for a moment, my breath held in the silence, before the noise stopped abruptly. My heart raced in my chest, my palms beginning to sweat. I didn't know what to make of it. Perhaps it was just the wind, the trees outside rubbing against the cabin, creating noises that my mind was trying to make sense of. But something about the sound felt wrong. It didn't feel natural. Shaking it off, I continued with my exploration. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I began to notice something odd. The layout of the room seemed off. I had passed through what I assumed was the kitchen, and now found myself standing in front of another door, one I hadn't seen before. The room behind it was dim, the only light coming from a small crack in the wall, barely enough to see by. I pushed the door open cautiously. Inside was a small, narrow corridor that led to a steep staircase. I paused at the foot of the stairs, my mind racing. I hadn't noticed this part of the cabin before. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended slowly, the wooden banister slick with age. At the top of the stairs, I found another door, much like the others. The knob was cold in my hand, and as I turned it, the door swung open with a soft groan. The room beyond was dimly lit, with only the faintest light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The air was stale, thick with dust, and as I stepped inside, I felt a strange chill, the kind that seemed to seep into your bones. There was an old rocking chair in the corner, its back gently swaying back and forth. Though there was no wind, a small table sat beside it, with a single candle placed in the center. The faintest flicker of light from the candle seemed to pulse in time with the rocking chair's motion. I walked closer, my feet hesitant, my mind fighting the urge to turn and leave. But I couldn't. Something had drawn me here. The pull was undeniable. As I reached out for the candle, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. I jumped, startled, but the room remained eerily still. My fingers brushed the edge of the candle, and it immediately extinguished, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart skipped a beat, panic rising in my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, but as I turned it on, the beam flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the room. That's when I heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it was clear. Help. Me. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep within the walls, just behind the wooden panels. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The temperature in the room had dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I rushed to the wall, my hand running over the rough wood. I didn't know what I expected to find, but my fingers brushed against something cold, something metallic. I pressed harder, and with a groan, the wall seemed to shift. A small section of the wood gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, there was a small, tattered box, the kind that looked like it belonged to someone long forgotten. I opened it without thinking. Inside was a key, old, rusted, its surface worn by time. But the most unsettling thing inside the box wasn't the key. It was a photograph, old and faded, showing a man and a woman standing outside the very cabin I was in. Their smiles were wide, their eyes bright, but there was something off about it, something unsettling. The man's eyes were empty, hollow, and the woman, standing beside him, was staring at me through the photograph, her eyes cold, her expression knowing. A sudden violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and I dropped the box in shock. The photograph fluttered to the floor, the image of the woman's eyes still staring at me. I felt the whisper again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the rocking chair. The chair, still rocking gently, was now moving faster, as if someone, was sitting in it. I backed away, my body trembling, as the whispers grew louder. Don't leave. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing darker, thicker. And then I saw it. In the corner, standing just beyond the edge of the flickering light, was the figure of a man, his face obscured by shadows. But I could feel his eyes on me. Cold, empty eyes. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. The cabin's layout seemed to change as I sprinted through it, the walls twisting, the doors vanishing. But that figure, that man, followed me. His footsteps were behind me, echoing in the halls, getting closer and closer with each passing second. I reached the front door, yanked it open, and bolted outside into the forest. The trees closed in around me, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to escape. But the whispers followed me. They were in my mind now, repeating over and over again. Don't leave. You're already here. The night was thick with an eerie stillness, one that seemed to stretch into eternity. After the tapping on the window had stopped, I had tried to convince myself that it was just a random occurrence, perhaps a branch or an animal brushing against the glass. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. It was as if someone was lurking just beyond the cabin, watching, waiting. I lay there in bed, my mind racing, my body tense. The silence was suffocating, but the slightest sound, even the wind's whisper through the trees, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows growing longer with each passing second. I closed my eyes tightly, praying for sleep, but the weight of the night was too much. Sleep wouldn't come. Then came the noise. It was soft at first, barely audible, a low scraping sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the cabin. It was so subtle that I almost convinced myself it was part of the house settling, the floorboards stretching with the change in temperature. But it wasn't. The noise grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakably the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself along the floor beneath me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire in the living room below. I strained my ears, trying to listen more closely, but all I could hear was the unmistakable scrape of something heavy, moving against the floorboards, dragging itself with deliberate slowness. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. What in God's name could it be? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was an animal trapped under the floorboards, scratching at the wood, looking for a way out. But even that explanation didn't sit right. The sound was too purposeful, too controlled. It wasn't the random clawing of a creature trying to escape. It was something more methodical, as if it was moving with intention. A cold sweat began to bead on my forehead as the scraping noise continued. My eyes darted to the window, then to the door, but they offered no comfort. There was no escape from whatever was happening beneath me. I had to know what it was. I couldn't just lie here in terror, waiting for something worse to happen. I had to investigate. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my knees shaking. My breath came out in shallow gasps, the cold air of the room making my skin crawl. I crept to the top of the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, as I descended into the living room. The fire was barely a flicker now, the room dimly lit by the embers that still glowed in the fireplace. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, and I could feel it pressing in on me. The scraping noise had stopped, but I could still hear faint thuds, like something moving just below the floor. I stood motionless, waiting for another sound, my heart thumping in my chest. My breath felt shallow, my palms slick with sweat. The noise came again, closer this time, just beneath my feet. I glanced around the room, my gaze landing on the wooden floorboards, there, in the corner of the room. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint outline, like the shape of a trapdoor, hidden beneath layers of dust. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't noticed it when I first entered, but it was there now, as clear as day. Without thinking, I walked toward it, every fiber of my being telling me to turn back, but my feet moved forward against my will. I crouched down and gently ran my fingers along the edge of the hidden trapdoor. It was cold to the touch, the wood slick with moisture. As I traced the edges, I realized that it was loose, barely hanging on by a single nail. I yanked it open. A sharp, metallic scent hit my nostrils as I stared into the darkness below. The hole was deep, far deeper than I had expected. The faint glow from the fireplace couldn't reach far enough to illuminate whatever lay beneath. But there was something else. Something darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I felt a chill race down my spine. There was something down there. I could feel it. Before I could stop myself, I dropped to my knees and peered into the hole. The blackness seemed to stretch on forever. And then, just as I was about to pull back, a figure appeared in the dark. A pale face, its eyes wide open, staring directly at me. It was impossible. The figure wasn't real. It couldn't be. But there it was, suspended in the darkness, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. My mind couldn't comprehend what I had just seen. The figure. It wasn't human. It was wrong. Twisted, like something that didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl coming from deep within the hole. My eyes widened in terror as I realized that whatever was down there wasn't just watching me. It was waiting. Waiting for me to get closer. I backed away, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I turned to run, but just as I was about to bolt for the door, I heard a voice. A whisper so faint I almost didn't catch it. It came from behind me, from the darkness below. "Come closer." I froze. The voice was deep, gravelly, almost familiar, but it wasn't human. I turned back to the hole, my hands shaking. The figure was still there, its eyes fixed on me, unmoving. Before I could react, I heard a loud crash from above, the sound of something heavy falling to the floor in the loft. I spun around, panic flooding my veins. The voice in the darkness continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Come closer." or it will find you. I didn't wait another second. I didn't care about the figure or the voice anymore. I ran for the door, tearing it open and slamming it behind me. Outside, the forest was still dark, and the air was thick with the stench of wet leaves and decay. But it was the only thing that felt real anymore. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin wasn't finished with me. The dread, the terror, it was just beginning. I ran through the cold night, the air sharp against my skin, the silence of the forest deafening. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears as I pushed my legs to carry me faster. I didn't dare look back. I knew that whatever had been in that cabin, whatever had been waiting for me below, was still out there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. The trees seemed to close in around me as I ran, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, grabbing at my clothes, pulling at my skin. But I didn't care. I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I had to get out of this nightmare. The cabin was still visible behind me, a dark silhouette against the fading moonlight, but it felt like a lifetime away. I glanced over my shoulder for a split second, my breath ragged, my eyes wide with fear. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. But the sense of being watched was undeniable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my every instinct telling me to keep moving, to keep running. Suddenly, I stumbled. My foot caught on a rock hidden beneath the underbrush, and I went tumbling to the ground, my body crashing into the dirt with a painful thud. For a moment, everything went black. The world around me spun, and my limbs felt like lead. My head throbbed as I lay there, disoriented and terrified. I pushed myself up, coughing, gasping for air. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the terror clawing at my chest. I looked around, my heart racing, only to see that the forest was no longer the same. The trees seemed to have shifted. The path I had been following now gone, replaced by dense thickets and twisted branches that seemed to stretch out like veins across the earth. I was lost. I staggered to my feet, panic rising in my throat. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body trembling with cold and fear. I turned in circles, trying to find some sign of the way out, but the darkness had swallowed everything. The forest felt alive, closing in on me with every step I took. And then I heard it. A voice. Low, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. You're not alone. I froze, the words cutting through the air like a blade. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't a whisper from the trees or the wind. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. My pulse quickened, my stomach turning with dread. I was no longer in control. Whatever had been waiting for me in the cabin, it had followed me. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkened forest, but there was nothing there. The voice came again, closer this time, as though it was right behind me. Come back. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The air felt thick, suffocating. The forest was holding its breath, waiting, as if the very land was a trap closing in on me. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something. A cold, slick stone hidden beneath the leaves. I stumbled again, falling backward into a shallow hole that hadn't been there moments before. My hands scraped against the rough surface as I tried to catch myself. But I couldn't stop the fall. I landed with a sickening thud, my head striking something hard beneath the surface. Everything went dark. I awoke to the sensation of something wet and cold on my skin. My head was pounding, my vision blurry as I tried to sit up. I wiped my eyes, only to find that my hands were covered in a thick viscous substance. I looked around, panic flooding my senses. I was no longer in the forest. I was in a cave. The walls around me were slick with moisture, the ground beneath me uneven and treacherous. The air was damp and musty, thick with the scent of decay. I could hear the distant echo of water dripping somewhere in the dark, but it was the other sounds, the sounds that I couldn't quite place, that filled me with dread, a low rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. I stood, my legs shaky as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. I was in a tunnel of sorts, the walls narrow and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of the darkness, suffocating, as if it was alive, watching me. And then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, just before the darkness swallowed it up entirely, there was a flicker of movement. A shadow, no, a figure, darted across the far wall, disappearing into the blackness. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. But I wasn't alone. The shadows shifted again, this time closer. I could hear the sound of someone, dragging itself toward me, the scraping of something heavy, scraping along the stone floor, growing louder with each passing second. I wanted to run. I needed to escape. But my legs refused to move. My body was frozen in place. My mind consumed with terror. My thoughts scattered. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. And then, from the darkness, the voice came again. You shouldn't have come. It was deeper now, darker, laced with something I couldn't quite grasp. It was a voice that felt like it had been carved from the very bowels of the earth, and I could feel it inside me, inside my bones, gnawing at my sanity. I turned stumbling, my hands grasping at the walls of the tunnel for support. But there was nowhere to run. The passage was narrow, the walls closing in on me. I could feel something, or someone, growing closer, the sound of scraping feet reverberating through the stone. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A door that had not been there moments ago. A door made of old rotting wood, its surface cracked and splintered with age. It seemed to pulse, alive with an otherworldly energy, as if it was calling to me. I didn't hesitate. I ran. But the closer I got, the further it seemed to move, as if the door was playing a cruel game, pulling just out of reach every time I thought I was close enough. The footsteps behind me were louder now, closer, and I knew I didn't have much time. Whatever was chasing me wasn't going to stop. Finally, I reached the door, my hands trembling as I gripped the handle. I yanked it open, my heart in my throat, praying that it was a way out. But as I stepped through, everything changed. I was back in the cabin, the one I had fled from. The same dark room, the same oppressive silence, and the same feeling of someone, watching me from the shadows. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I turned to see the figure standing there, just beyond the flickering light of the fire. And in its hands was a key to the door I had just opened. It had always been here,